Welcome to the State of Democracy lecture. It's the third in the series for this year. I'm Grant Reher. I'm director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute here at the Maxwell School. Jon Trickett's visit is part of the British invasion that I mentioned last semester. After this, we will return to the States in a fashion with our final lecture on April 29th when Juan Cole visits us from the University of Michigan to speak about developments in the Middle East. I have some quick thank yous and introductions to make, and then I'm going to get out of the way, and you'll hear from the speakers. First, thanks to the Dean's Office for supporting the series and for technical support, the Information Computing Technology Group, and in particular, Tom Fazio. I also want to thank my colleague Elizabeth Cohen, who helps to organize the series, and Bethany Wallowender and Kelly Coleman, who work in the Institute and help put together this event and the other State of Democracy events. Today we're in keeping with our traditional format of a lecture followed by two brief faculty responses, and then we'll open it up for what I think will be a lively question and answer period and comments. And then after that we'll have a nice reception out in the hall where you'll get a chance to speak with Jon individually and the respondents. Let me start first with the two respondents. Ken Baines is a professor of philosophy and political science. Two recent publications of his that have particular relevance, I think, to what Jon has to say are Toward a Political Conception of Human Rights and Democratic Equality and Respect. Seth Jolly is a political science professor who writes on European Union politics and the effects of European integration on subnational nationalist movements, such as the Scottish and the United Kingdom. Now the main talk. Today is probably a pretty good day to hear a talk titled In Defense of Government. As we teeter on the brink of shutting ours down, I just checked the internet when I came in, and I did not see any evidence of a deal. If someone knows differently, please correct me. Jon Trickett is a former mayor of Leeds. It's a city in the north of England about the size of Indianapolis. Since 1996, he's been a Labour Party member of Parliament and has served in the governments of both Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. As a backbencher, he was also a leader of the protest within Parliament of the Iraq War. He's now a shadow minister in the opposition, providing strategic advice to the Labour leader, Ed Miliband. And for some of my social science colleagues, yes, there is a relation. Ed is the son of Ralph Miliband. The only other thing that I'll say before I sit down is that I was reminded this morning at a much smaller gathering with students and some faculty about why I've been wanting to bring Jon out to Syracuse. He was telling a story about how, as a Parliament member, he wrestled with the demands of party loyalty and his own conscience regarding the Iraq War. And even though I'm guessing that there are folks here who will disagree with some of the things that Jon has to say about the role of government, and that's one of the points, actually, the authenticity and the honesty that I've seen in Jon's willingness to talk about the different aspects of political representation as he's experienced them have inspired me. So it's a real pleasure for me to welcome Jon here today of all days. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. It's been a really interesting day. I've met lots of students and staff as well, and it reminds me of all the good things which we know about America and which inspires us in Europe and especially in the United Kingdom. And I think it's true to say that I am certainly on the left of the British Labour Party, and as the slides there says, trying to give a left perspective. We talked long and hard about using the word left because I'm told it's not a word which everybody feels comfortable with in the United States. But then as the word liberal substituted for the word left, and that became unpopular too, and so now we're all progressives, at least those of us on the left-hand side. But it reminds me of Winston Churchill's famous saying that here we are, two peoples, the British and the Americans, separated by a common language. And, well, I'm going to try to express myself in ways which show the deep admiration for the values which founded your republic and which have inspired me, and I try to explain why I felt so inspired by the ideas which you encounter if you approach American political history with an open mind. But let me first start by just talking a little bit about myself, if you'll forgive me, and you'll see the connecting rationale behind the points as I develop my argument. Because when I went to high school at the age of 11, it rapidly became clear to me, almost within days, I think, that I was not going to succeed. And by the time I'd reached the age of 15, already a rebel, which was to prefigure some political rebellions I did later, the head teacher came to me and said, John, well actually he said Trickett. He said, Trickett, you're not going to succeed at school. You ought to just leave. And although the statutory school leaving age was 16, I left school illegally at the age of 15, but with the blessing of the head teacher and probably some of the staff as well. I left school with no qualifications at all. But although there's a humorous side to it, I did feel that I'd failed. And the whole of my school years were marked by a sense of failure. I felt that I'd let my mum and dad down, and my family too. I went off to work on building sites as a plumber, as a manual worker. But the thought increasingly came into my mind that I had not failed, but that the education system, that school, had failed me. Later on, another thought came into my mind. I thought, actually, the system fails people like me. And that act of imagination, to go from my personal experience to the idea that people like me are failed by the system, is a profoundly political thought. And from there, it's not a very long step to a further act of the imagination, which is that, in fact, societies like ours can be deeply unfair to millions of people who come from ordinary or poorer backgrounds. And that thought resonated through my mind. It was like an explosion which had occurred inside my head. And the idea that societies are organized in a way where a minority succeed but the majority don't has resonated. Those ideas have resonated in my mind ever since. I began to read books and to think about how society works. And later, I went off to take myself through college and then on to university. And by one of those amazing coincidences which happened in life, my professor at that time was Ralph Miliband, the father of the new leader of the Labour Party, Ed Miliband, who is now my neighbour in Yorkshire. The fact that I was then reasonably successful in academic terms at university reinforced in me the idea that I had always had somewhere inside of me the intrinsic intelligence to be able to succeed. But I also equally thought that but for an accident, I might have lived the whole of my life feeling that I was a failure, and that millions of people maybe have that feeling throughout their lives. Later on in life, as was just said, I became the mayor of Leeds, the equivalent of the mayor, we call it the leader, a city of almost 800,000 people. In due course, I entered Parliament to become a Labour MP, and I worked in number 10 Downing Street, which is the seat of government, as you know, in the United Kingdom. That first period in power was under Tony Blair as a Prime Minister. But it came clear to me very quickly that actually the new Labour government, which I was then a member of, was losing touch with the wider population. And it was losing touch particularly with the people of my kind, from my background, who I represent. I represent a working class constituency. And those people in my constituency who had actually elected Labour to power did feel let down. And so I left the government and was a backbencher for many years. And in particular, as Grant has just said, I objected to the war in Iraq. I regarded the war as both immoral and illegal. We may talk about that later. When Tony Blair finally left office, I then returned to number 10 Downing Street. It was a great privilege to serve a second time, this time under Gordon Brown as the new Prime Minister. And I left Downing Street when we left office last year. My current role, I'm now serving a third Labour leader, is as a member of the Shadow Cabinet, working under the new leader, Ed Miliband. Our task is to renew and rebuild Labour under the entirely new circumstances of having been defeated in an election last year and also in the shadow of this great global financial crisis. I believe politics should be based on values. I left office under Blair, in part at least, because I could not accept the decision to go to war. It seems to me you can choose in politics to either be a career politician or a conviction politician. But occasionally it may be the case, as it was in mine, as it turns out, that your career may benefit if you do stick fast to your convictions. And the Iraqi war was a case in point. I vividly recall the weeks before the Iraq war. You could hear the drums of war beat louder, especially after Tony Blair had visited the Texas ranch. But it seemed to me impossible to vote with the government, my own government, facing the prospect that thousands of innocent lives would be lost in a war fought on a lie. And in the first vote which took place in the September, I think, 2002, only a few dozen of us voted against the war, while hundreds of members of Parliament voted in favour. And in the public opinions too, there was an overwhelming majority in favour of that war. But if you had a vote now, the reverse would clearly be the case. Only a few dozen MPs would vote for the war, and hundreds would vote against. And the lesson I learned from this experience is, you may be in a small minority, but you should hold fast to your principles. And it can happen that you will ultimately be proved right in the court of history. Now, in recent decades, it's possible to argue that progressives or liberals or lefties or however you want to describe us lost our way because we lost confidence in progressive values. On both sides of the Atlantic, we came to believe that right-wing or conservative ideas were so dominant in our society that we need to disguise our intentions or we would never win power again. This approach was first pioneered by Bill Clinton, and it became known as triangulation. The central idea was that progressives needed to shift in a right-wing direction to embrace some of the tenets of conservatism in order to win elections. In Britain, Tony Blair watched very, very carefully what Clinton did. He formed New Labour based on the idea of the New Democrats. And both Clinton and Blair, as we know, won resounding victories in famous elections. But the process of triangulation itself led, in my view, them eventually to lose touch with the very progressive majority who had voted them into office. And I saw this process at the closest possible hand. It was a bizarre experience going from Downing Street, where decisions were being taken, to the deprived communities I represented on the other, sometimes in the same day, and see how there was a mismatch between what the government was doing and what the people needed. And so many local people told me that they thought that New Labour had lost its bearings and no longer represented them. I frequently heard the phrase, often repeated, and I suppose you will have too here, that you politicians, you're all the same, there's no difference between you. And it's true that New Labour under Tony Blair were far too managerial and far too technocratic. And so many of our voters simply stayed at home. And finally, at the last election last year, we lost. And we lost not because of a conservative revival, as the people who argue triangulation would say. We lost because our voters stayed at home. And so last year, our conservative opponents only gained 1 million votes, more than they had when Tony Blair had beaten them so resoundingly in 1997. But my party had lost 5 million votes. And as a result, as we know, New Labour lost. And so this is a reason now why Labour needs to move on beyond New Labour. And we need to do so confidently, restating our core progressive values, or left values, fairness, equality, and justice. I rather think something similar may have happened here during the Clinton years. After all, Bush did not win the election at the ballot box. the first election. He won it in the Supreme Court. But Obama did something very different. Whilst not neglecting to focus on those people who are the key voters who swing in their party allegiance between one party and another, candidate Obama sought to enthuse and mobilize democratically inclined people who had either never voted ever or had ceased voting Democrat a long time ago. Now, it's not for me to exercise judgment as to whether his decisions in office have now become a form of triangulation and have led to disappointment to his electoral base or not. That decision will be made at the ballot box next year. But learning from the way in which Obama won, I think, is a key task facing my party. We need both and at the same time to build a majoritarian progressive coalition which focuses on retaining the loyalty of the political centre ground whilst at the same time re-energising those millions of voters, progressive individuals, people who will share Labour values, but who stopped voting for us during the years of New Labour. And so, as you'll gather, I strongly believe it's better to base your politics on a set of values rather than on tactical judgments and expediency. Now, let me return to the thought which I began the lecture with, the idea of fairness and equality, which are the cornerstones for those of us on the left of politics. It's hard to resist the suggestion, not that all human beings are the same, nor that uniformity should be the goal of government, but that our common humanity means that all human beings have the same moral and ethical equivalence, but that it is social and economic forces which make us so unequal, sometimes obscenely unequal. When you think that millions of children die each year on our planet from starvation, while a handful of children are born into the extreme wealth. Now, when as a young man I was considering what happened to me and to many of the people with whom I had grown up, and to the unfair distribution of life chances which I was just describing, I began to do much reading. And I found some ideas which have had a profound influence on thinkers over at least 25 centuries. For example, the idea that the common humanity inside us all means that whatever our differences, there is a fundamental equality between all human beings. And this idea is found even in the first book of the Bible, where it says, and this is in Genesis, which was written 500 years before Christ. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. The idea that in every single human being was created in the image of God implies then a spark of divinity or common humanity in every one of us, and that fundamentally we are all equal. Now, in 1381, so 2,000 years later, I'm moving, fast-forwarding through history quite rapidly here. In 1381, in London, a radical preacher called John Ball spoke up on behalf of the poorest in England when he pointed out that at the time when God had created the Garden of Eden, there was no inequality and there were no class divisions. He said, when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? And in those days, the gentleman was a wealthy person who ruled over the rest of society. John Ball's question, which echoes with radical ideas through to the present day, suggests that class inequality was never part of the divine plan, and that classes and deep and profound inequalities only arose after mankind fell from grace. If we move forward again a further few centuries, we find something very inspiring in the American Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. These ideas are inspiring. And when I reflected on my own personal experience and the experience of millions of other people, I came to the conclusion that it is unjust and wrong that society should be so organized that the majority are held down, whilst privilege and wealth is given to a few. And here's something fascinating. The second sentence of the same Declaration of Independence says something extraordinary. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted amongst men and women, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Governments are obliged to help to ensure that all men achieve equality. Those are the two sentences in that very famous document, that government should act to secure those rights. And so, I think that's a fascinating thought. Government came into existence to secure the rights to which all human beings are entitled, based on our fundamental equality. But let me just say I'm slightly remiss in not saying how delighted I am to be here in Syracuse. Over the years, I've had a number of contacts with students and staff from the university. It's a fine place, and now I've had a chance to see it, I'm convinced of how fine it is. And I expect that all here, all students here, and all staff too, have a fantastic experience, and that the students have a great start in life with the help of this institution. But you know, I'm even more excited to be in Syracuse for a second reason. And this second reason allows me to develop my argument. I am personally honoured to be speaking in a city which played, on a certain day, a very important role in history. And I'm sure you're all well aware of it, but I'm going to talk about it anyway. And I was fascinated to learn of the story. Prior to the Civil War, and in defence of the federal law, Syracuse became known as the Grand Central Station, as you know, of the Underground Railroad. Slaves who escaped from their masters in the South were still regarded as property of other human beings. Even in the Northwest, slavery didn't exist. And so the escapees moved, as we know, up the Underground Railroad, helped all the way by brave people, until eventually they achieved their freedom. And Syracuse was the Grand Central Station for two reasons. First, it was the end of so many different lines, because the next step was to Canada and true freedom. And secondly, because so many members of this community in those days were adamantly opposed to slavery. And so on October the 1st, 1851, here in this town, a freed slave called Jerry was arrested under the fugitive slave law. But what happened then? Several hundred local folk broke into the jail. They freed Jerry, and the event became known as the Jerry Rescue. What an amazing event to take place here in this town, not so many yards from where we are now. But, and this is the crucial point, this man Jerry was given his liberty by this community in the name of a big idea, the idea that all men, as we saw, are created equal, and that no man should be the slave of another. Of course, freeing individual slaves was a great achievement, but it's one person. Ridding the country of slavery was something else. And only when Lincoln finally took hold of the presidency, after some time of reflection and debate, and then took control of the Union Army, was slavery itself as an institution finally abolished. Government acting decisively to emancipate the slaves. And when Lincoln had decided, he didn't triangulate. He wasn't a technocrat. He didn't suffer from managerialism. He acted, and he was motivated by a powerful set of values. His actions were driven by a strong sense of morality. Think about Lincoln and think about Syracuse. Government, acting on behalf of many thousands of communities, like there was in this town, and on behalf of the revolutionary doctrines of liberty and equality, government was the agency of change which delivered an end to slavery. Now, there is an echo of this thought in something which Roosevelt said when he connected the idea of community with the idea of government. He says, "What is the state? It is the duly constituted representative of an organized society created by them for their mutual protection and well-being. And who, but a tiny handful of extremists, could possibly agree with that?" Well, we'll see if there are people who do disagree with that statement when I finish. But Roosevelt issued a warning. The liberty of a government is not safe if the people tolerate the growth of private power to a point where it becomes stronger than the democratic state itself. And when you think now of the power of Wall Street or the influence of billionaires over your political parties, it is hard to avoid the conclusion that government is indeed being diverted from its primary purpose of serving the people by the power of wealth exercising influence. It's extraordinary to imagine that in my country, my last election, I think we spent $12,000 in 5 years. And I'm told that one of the local candidates here spent $2.5 million. Sadly, it didn't win in the election, but still, the difference is quite extraordinary. And so this idea brings me to the final set of thoughts in my argument. But before developing those arguments, I'll give you a clue that you may have worked out by now of the direction of my argument. If I quote the following sentence, a sentence from one of your most eminent presidents, Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson echoes Roosevelt's argument about government being subject to arbitrary power by financial interests. But he's far more pointed than Roosevelt. He says it's the banks which may well take control of government in the place of the control of government by the people. Banking institutions, he says, he's talking about private banking institutions, are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies. Well, I don't know if he was a fortune teller or what, but that's an extraordinary prescient statement to make. Anyway, I'm in danger of getting ahead of my argument. I'll get there eventually. I want to show you some slides about a country which you know well. Now, first of all, wages and salaries in this country now make up the lowest share of the nation's gross national product, since the government ever recorded data, while corporate profits are now at their highest ever recorded. And the graph here shows the deep and widening gulf between the vast majority of hard-working Americans and the tiny, because we're speaking about the United States, and the tiny number of the super rich. I dare say you can all see that for yourselves. But the next one's even more striking, the next slide. Do you know that the median earnings, the middle earnings for male workers in the United States is lower now than it was in 1980. All of the additional wealth which has been created in this country since that time has gone to the top 5%, most of it to the top 1%. And you can see after taxation, because the tax changes which occurred since that time have favoured only the 1%. The tax changes for everybody else, the 99% who make up this country, have resulted, as you'll see, the static or declining incomes. Now, similar statistics, though not quite as pronounced, but we are almost as unequal as the United States, can be seen in my own country. The United States and Britain are amongst the most unequal in the whole world. This cannot really have been what was envisaged by the authors of the Declaration of Independence. I simply do not believe that such profound inequality is good for society. And indeed, recent work by epidemiologists has shown beyond doubt that profound inequality produces dysfunctional societies. As you all know, epidemiologists devote themselves to the detailed study of statistical evidence in relation to health and other forms of social dysfunction. And it's recently been showing that the most divided societies are the sickest. Let's see what this tells us, because on one side is the more unequal societies, and up this side are the health issues. So this is a compilation of a number of different statistical measures of the sickness of a society, including physiological illness too. And what you will see is the more unequal the society, the sicker that society is. Extraordinarily, people in Vietnam living on $3 a day have a longer life expectancy than working class males in my country. And I leave you to guess the figures for black people in the south of the United States in terms of their life expectancy. And the question mark at the top, if I was to remove it, I don't know how to remove it, but there's a way of removing it, would reveal that that is the USA. That is the USA. It's almost off the map. Gross inequality produces ill health, high crime, high suicide rate, fragmentation of the sense of community upon which a country is reliant to bind it together. Now, let's briefly consider the current economic crisis. In both the United States and in Britain, it's evident that the roots of the crisis, it's evident to me anyhow, lie in unregulated banking and finance. At the heart of the banking and financial system were the values of the casino, where greed was a central driving force rather than social responsibility. And when the crisis hit, we know that the bankers showed no shame. They went straight to government, cap in hand, and claimed that they were too big to fail. And indeed, they were too big to fail. They were rescued with the application of taxpayer dollars in sums so large that those figures are almost unimaginable. If you recall the crash of the Lehman Brothers, for example, as an example, it's clear that at that time President Bush initially believed that government should not attempt to control the markets. That government should get off people's backs. And so he allowed Lehman Brothers to collapse. 30 million people across the Western world lost their jobs as a result of the collapse of Lehman Brothers. 30 million lives and families as a result of corporate greed, almost criminal behaviour at Lehman Brothers, and by the failure of government. President Bush realised then, but it was too late, that he had to use the power of government, that even President Bush felt he had to begin, and so he did reluctantly, to bail out a number of other financial institutions. Now, all of that took place in the September of that year, and by chance, I then went back into Downing Street to work as Gordon Brown's political advisor that weekend. And what we did, I think we made many mistakes, was we took ownership of the banks. The British government took ownership of the British banks, the ones that were going to fail. And we injected £50 billion, what's that, 70 or $80 billion, I don't know, in order to avoid a financial meltdown. government intervened to take ownership of the banks in order to protect the wider society. The only regret I have looking back is that we didn't take more powers over the banks to screw them down even tighter than we did. And now that the financial system appears to be beginning to restabilise, the bankers seem to have added a second illness to the first. They've added collective amnesia as a second vice to add to their shamelessness. For now we suddenly hear Wall Street saying, well, it's not the financial system which has to pay for this crisis, but it's Main Street which must pay. And everywhere we see, not only in America, but everywhere, we see attacks on ordinary folk, house prices collapsing, taxation increasing, higher unemployment, homeless increasing, pension conditions being made worse, and so on. It is extraordinary to hear the arguments being made that the crisis is in effect the fault of ordinary folk. And it's equally extraordinary to hear the argument being made, again by the rich and powerful, that what is wrong is that government is wrong. Government should get off people's backs. But if government had been more on their backs, instead of deregulating the banks, we might never have suffered the crash in the first place. And if it wasn't for government, Wall Street would have collapsed, and with it the Western economy. In my country, and indeed across Europe, we now see a tidal wave of right-wing governments whose solution to the crisis was on the one hand to bail out the banks and the financial managers, and then on the other hand to slash away at the public services and the pay of ordinary people, the hard-working majority. Now, let's talk about Wisconsin a moment or two. In Great Britain, we look to the United States to see what is happening, because what often happens in America today happens to us tomorrow. And often it's a good thing. So, as I've described, I'm inspired by the ideas of the founding fathers. But when most honest people look at the world economy, they conclude that what was wrong was dysfunctional banking and financial sectors. There we are. But Governor Walker has come to what seems to me to be a perverse conclusion, that the problem of the moment is government, and that public workers' pay is the most serious fiscal issue facing the state. And so, as we know, he has now launched an assault on the... Let's see if we can get to the right page. Launched an assault on public workers' pay and on the freedom of people to join together in labour unions. This amounts, to an outsider, this looks as though it is an attack on nothing less than the core Western principle of liberty itself. The liberty of free people voluntarily to come together in free associations in order to pursue their common interest. That's what a labour union is or ought to be. And I know there's a debate about the way in which the labour unions are constructed in this country, but nonetheless, this is an attack on liberty. And this attack is carried out for one reason only, which is to perpetuate inequality. It's hard to see what is happening in Wisconsin as anything other than an assault on the very freedom and equality, which, as we saw earlier, were enshrined in the founding documents of the Republic. What is happening in Wisconsin, even more so, is the very antithesis of what happened on October the 1st, 1851, here in this town. What we are witnessing too in Europe is a new age of austerity. This is undermining access to essential services like education and healthcare, which were provided great opportunities to people to fill their own personal goals in recent decades. And in both continents, in America and in Europe, but most clearly of all in Wisconsin, and I think in the minds of other governors too, we see both liberty and the principle of equality being rolled back. So, how are we today best to defend these values? As I learned at the beginning of my speech, it's part of my personal experience and my political philosophy that the individual faces disadvantage due to social oppression, be that of class, race or gender, and that because of these social oppressions, tackling them requires us to organise a collective response, preferably through government. And the trade unions in this country and elsewhere ought to be one of the agencies which secure our future. And here is a picture of a great demonstration which took place in London, which my wife and I were on 2 weeks ago. Over 500,000 people were on the streets of London responding to the call of the trade unions. And I think there are, 300 million people in America? So that's 5 times the size of Great Britain. So that's equivalent in US terms of 2.5 to 3 million people on the streets responding to the call by the labour unions to defend their rights and to press forward. By its actions, governments, if they are freed from the overwhelming power of wealth, can be used to liberate individuals. If government provides its good health service, good education and legislation to protect the vulnerable, then it is providing the means by which an individual can reach their potential. Government can act in a way to create a social ladder. In my own case, I was given a second chance. I went to college and university, thanks to the power of the whole of our community putting money into education. On the contrary, if government denies these services, then the life chances of millions will be held back. And so we need government which act in the interest of the people, which redistribute wealth, which provide schooling and health services, and which tackle discrimination. And at the moment, we need government which stands with the people to counter the powerful interests which are seeking to make those who did not cause the financial crisis now pay for it. The economic crisis and its aftermath poses serious questions about the nature of government in democracy, where inequality has grown so deeply ingrained and is so acute. There is a real danger, though, that the power of Wall Street is now so all-embracing that democratic government is effectively being subordinated to the power of financial interest, such that Main Street ends up having to pay. I would argue that the response of the majority should be to return to your original founding values. This is the historic task of the left in politics. I return to the growth of inequality in recent years and the consequences of the crisis, and I say this: either the people will use democracy to restrict the wealth and privileges of the bankers, or the bankers will use government to attack our ancient liberties in order to maintain their wealth and privileges. And with that, we will have abandoned once and for all that most basic idea that all men were created equal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John, especially for the philosophy that you gave a quick sketch of. As some of you know, I'm a political philosopher housed in the philosophy department here, not a political scientist, and so it was nice to get that review. And I also have to say that I find myself in such deep agreement with so many of the points that you were making that I'm not quite sure where to begin. Maybe with the L word, which I had to chuckle about, right? Is it left? Is it liberal? Is it something else? I'm from the state of Massachusetts. And the first election I voted in was George McGovern. We know what happened then. Then Mike Dukakis ran for president from the state of Massachusetts, and that's when the L word became unspeakable, and that was liberal, not leftist. And much of my own career, I think, I teach a course on liberalism and its critics, is just trying to figure out what we mean by liberalism. What does it mean to be a liberal? what's the difference between liberalism and libertarianism, if indeed there is a difference. That's a very big discussion. I'm also someone who identifies himself as a left Rawlsian. So I brought the left word back in, but for those of you that know the work of Rawls in Theory of Justice, captured very much what John was summarizing in his own remark. And I think that what's happened in the United States today is in fact a deep failure of our commitment to a social contract. That is, to ensure that since we're all common citizens in a common polity, to ensure that the advantages, achievements of some work to the improvement of all in society. And that's what, of course, is expressed in Rawls's very influential difference principle, that those who benefit shouldn't do so unless they also bring along those who have, through no morally relevant reason, been left behind. And I've just recently read The Spirit Level, which is the quote or the diagram about where the United States falls with respect to degree of inequality and well-being. It's a very, very good book to read. But I've read, in connection with that, two others that I want to mention. One by Robert Reich called Aftershock, which I recommend, which is also looking at the growing inequality in the United States today. And now, since you are the political philosopher, I'll take a minute and be a political scientist, right? In the early 70s, in the early 70s, which was a sort of end of a period of prosperity in the United States, as according to Reich, the top 1% earned about 10% of the wealth in the United States. Today, the top 1% in the United States earn over 20% of the income. That's a huge, huge difference. And I think that it is in large part because of a failure of government that this kind of this growing inequality has emerged through, as John also mentioned, the deregulation of the financial and banking industry, which led to the Great Bubble and then the collapse in 2008. So we mentioned one other book, very important book, I think, too, by Simon Johnson, called 13 Bankers, that some of you may be familiar with, which traces, beginning not with Bush, but in the Clinton administration, the deregulation of the financial and banking industries and how this led to the crisis. And then not only President Bush, but Obama coming in, and instead of, as you suggested was done in Great Britain, taking over the banking and financial industries that were failing, instead gave them a bailout. And this was in contrast to what U.S. policy recommendations had been to other countries that were in deep financial crises and failing in their financial industry, where the IMF imposed very stiff regulations on how they would deal with it. Instead, Obama took the strategy of bailing out. And again, as some of you may be aware, the financial industry has reported the greatest profits ever in 2010, and again, payouts in benefits and compensations to members of the financial industry as a result of this, while those who have lost their homes through foreclosures and otherwise, or the 9% unemployment we're dealing with in the United States, continue to suffer from this. So government has failed. Why has government failed? I think also because of what Simon Johnson calls the emergence of a new oligarchy in the United States, between the economic elites, many in the financial industry. Look at what's going on in the Obama administration, who his advisors are. I won't mention names here. And the kind of revolving doors that still exist between the political elite and the economic elite in the United States. We won't, I think, be able to address the kinds of the steps that are needed to fashion a new social contract or develop a new Deal, right, until the kinds of intimate relations, power relations that exist between the banking and financial industry and the political powers, regardless of whether they're in the Democratic Party or in the Republican Party, are addressed. We need to do that through the kind of voter turnout we're seeing in the election in Wisconsin, and we need to see that elsewhere, where people become angry about the denial of collective bargaining powers to workers, to the attack on unions, and the decline of union powers in battling corporate power in the United States today. I think it's a large and huge project. I have days when I'm more and less optimistic about what the prospects are, but I think that we can't fulfill the kind of commitment that citizens owe to one another, back to the Rawlsian difference principle again, that the good fortune advantages of the better off should only be permitted and allowed in a society that's committed to something like a social contract when they work to the advantage of the least well off. Thank you. Take a seat over there.
Thank you all for coming, and especially I thank Jon for coming. His discussion this morning was interesting, but he outdid himself this afternoon, so I'm glad there were so many people here to hear it. I think it's a powerful discussion on increasing income inequality in the U.S. with the graphs, but as Jon says, and I know the trends are also there in Europe, especially in the UK. And more importantly, he pointed to the problems that go along with that dramatic income inequality and ways we might be able to go around fixing those things. But along with Ken, if you're waiting for vivid disagreement or things like this about that particular component, you'll be disappointed, as I also find myself generally in agreement with Jon. However, where I find myself a little more skeptical is of the government's capacity and willingness to redress these problems. And so I'll limit my comments and questions to a few so we can get to your all's questions and comments as well. And rather than focus on the U.S., I really want to ask the Honourable Minister about how some trends in the UK, and I'll highlight a few, affect the government's ability to make effective change to fix these problems. In my view, the state in recent times, especially states like the UK, is subject to two types of threat to the capacity of the state. The first is a threat from above. Generally, you could talk about globalization and its effects, how it increasingly takes some capacities away from states. But more importantly, in the UK's case, is the EU. With each treaty, each decade, more bureaucratic and legislative authority is shifted up to the EU and the European Commission, which takes away and further from, I think, the working class people in Leeds. And I think this is prominent, too, with globalization more generally, with mobile capital, and especially this mobile super-rich class, which we increasingly read stories about plutocrats. There's all sorts of names for these people who sort of don't really have states. They just they have lots of power, though. So that's the first threat. The second threat, though, I think is a little bit different and focused on the UK. It's about devolution. There's continued discussion in Scotland over devolved tax and spending power. The recent vote in Wales to extend more lawmaking power to the Welsh Assembly. And while those things may be good in the long run for those communities, those regions, I wonder how these two trends affect Westminster's ability to reverse the increasing income inequality and the associated ills. So how much does this devolution of power, not just found in the UK and all across Western Europe especially, what I would say limit the ability of the central government to act in a certain way? So I know that I'm going quickly through these, but the comments are limited in time. In addition to these two trends, though, I want to shift gears quite a bit and highlight another issue, which is immigration and increasing diversity in the UK and in European countries more generally. And it's an issue that's, I think, obviously related to the fairness discussion that Jon spoke so eloquently about, dating in our history, among others. But here I want to shift the talk more about the government's willingness to act as opposed to the government's capacity to act. In the last decade, the UK has witnessed record numbers of new immigrants, and importantly, net immigrants. So more people come in every year, and many of those immigrants are not European immigrants and certainly not British immigrants. And compared to much of Western Europe, I would say that the UK is relatively welcoming to immigrants, particularly immigrants from non-European countries dating back to colonial times. The reason I bring this up, though, is recent studies by Alberto Alesina and others that show sort of a troubling relationship between ethnic diversity and public goods provision generally, but welfare state in particular. They claim that that ethnic diversity, as it increases, support for welfare diminishes. So the willingness of governments to act depends on people's willingness to pay. And they find that this claim partially explains the very minimal U.S. welfare state. And they demonstrate evidence, and I think there's plenty of other evidence from economists and so on, that this troubling relationship, at least troubling to me, exists both in local contexts as in school districts. So diverse school districts tend to have a harder time getting school bonds passed than homogeneous districts. And it's very true across countries. So if we put up a nice graph like you had with health and income inequality, if we put that up with diversity, public goods, it becomes very difficult. So the question then is, for the UK and for Western Europe more generally, is what does this increasing diversity, especially ethnic diversity, within countries mean for the European welfare states and the willingness of government to act to try to solve these problems? And again, many thanks for coming, and I really look forward to the discussion.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Jon, you probably have some things to say in response to that, but
Sure.
I think we should shift
Okay.
to questions and we can work that in later, because I know folks probably have questions or comments or...
Yes, I thought the examination of, I get all choked up. The examination of the impact of financial institutions as they challenge the left are very important. But what about the cultural challenges to the left? If you take a look at the challenge that we face in this country right now with regard to the debt crisis and the possible closing of the government, a writer on one of the bills calls for closing the funding for organizations like Planned Parenthood. And I guess my question is, how pronounced is that, and how do we account for this kind of working relationship between the financial institutions and those cultural institutions that also challenge the left?
Shall we take two or three together? Do you want to take two or three together, or...? I don't think we have exactly the same debate in Europe as you have here. It seems that the right in the United States have hit on an interesting phenomenon, which is the kind of cultural wars almost, which are going on between different parts of the country. And it does feel as though that you are extremely fragmented culturally, to the extent that the right are able to create a majority prospectus, not around the idea, oh, we've had a good idea, let's increase inequality, but they develop all kinds of second-order issues of a cultural character, as you say, about parenthood, Presumably, I don't know if you have these debates about gay marriage, you presumably do. I know about women's right to choose and all sorts of other issues. And the right of being able to hit on cultural issues to try to mobilise votes on non-economic matters. And I think that's a very interesting development. In our country, there's been an effort to do that, but it hasn't resonated. Still the kind of class loyalties and the link with party is still there in residual form. In a way, it isn't quite in the United States. It seems to me that class identities have dissolved to a considerable degree, if they ever existed in the United States, as a result of a complex set of cultural, regional and other factors. And that, I think, partly accounts for the success of the right over here, doing pretty unpopular things in terms of, unpleasant things anyway, in terms of inequality, but being able to mobilise majorities through other kind of issues. And that maybe the left, I don't know, has, or the progressives or whatever, been caught wrong-footed on those cultural issues. I don't know, but it's not the same in Europe, not to the same extent. Though I think in the Catholic countries in Europe, you can see the loyalty to the church, who have historically been not on the side of progressives, has meant that many people have voted for Catholic parties and often right-wing parties because of kind of religious loyalties, which may be against their own economic interests, but for those kind of historical, cultural factors. But that doesn't really exist in much of Northern Europe, I think, and certainly not in Britain. I just want to say one thing about immigration. I'd like to hear other people's views, but I think you are, as a country, quite interested in that debate, and I've heard immigration mentioned several times today. And it's true to say that immigration in Britain has been a major subject of debate. But you know what the truth really is that the big corporations want to reserve our army of labour, of cheap labour, to drive down the cost of labour generally to increase profitability. And the immigrants have been used as a source of cheap labour. And it's undermined trade unions and workers' rights. And of course, when, if you might call them indigenous people, feel suddenly that they're using, say, I don't know, people from Poland, so the employers recruit people from Poland, they pay them less money than they're paying to the people who were there in previous times, you know, been there for generations. Then what happens is the local people begin to feel xenophobic against those immigrants who are coming in. And it turns to forms of racism and it becomes very unpleasant. But the bottom line is, this is an economic process that's being done to drive down wages and conditions. We have a factory or a warehouse in my constituency, and they had 3 shifts, and they filled the whole of the Sunday shift and the night shifts with people from elsewhere, people who come in, as far as I'm concerned, were welcomed. But then they said to these people, we want you to vote in favour of wages which are the same as the day shift. But historically, people who work nights were paid more money because they were working social hours. And that shift, which was made up almost exclusively of people from Poland, voted for the same amount of money as were paid on the day shift. Now, local people were very, very angry about it. And they said, what's wrong with the country? There are too many Poles coming in. The truth is, what was wrong with the country was the employers were driving down wages using divisions between communities. And I think, you know, I wonder whether that does happen here or not. I imagine it probably does.
Let me set up a couple of elections. The British election, which Gordon Brown lost recently, and our election last November when the Republican and Tea Party groups won. I wonder if in both cases, all the lumps you give to the bankers and financial people and so on, I think they deserve to get those. But I wonder also if there isn't some other problem that has to do with the fact that Gordon Brown lost, and so did the anti-Tea Party people in this country for the most part. What's the matter with the people?
What I think is a problem is what's the matter with the left. That's my view of it, and I'm not going to express a criticism of somebody who's a progressive who holds the presidency now. It's not my job. I'm British, and I want him to succeed because the alternative isn't somebody who's more left, more progressive. The alternative is something appalling, like Sarah Palin or something. So I'm not going to criticise Obama in any way. But it's up to you as Americans to decide whether Obama actually represents the people who voted for him by the actions he's taken in office. The truth of the matter is that, as I've said absolutely clearly, make no mistake about it, I am amongst the leading members of the Labour Party, speaking today, unless I've been sacked in the last hour from what I said when it was being streamed. But my party lost touch with working class people who voted Labour. We started to represent, I said, we were technocratic, we were managerialist, we were too close to rich people. And the truth is that our voters stopped voting. 5 million people, Labour voters, stopped voting Labour. So there's nothing wrong with the people. The people came to a clear conclusion. This new Labour government was not representing us. We're not going to vote for it. And they stayed at home. That's a disaster because now what we've got a Conservative-led coalition which is taking an axe to all the public services. But they won by default. It's our fault. Is that? I can't be any clearer than that. It's the fault of the left if the left loses.
But I suppose the British people overall, I think they had a fair election in front of them, and the election ends up with a policy and a position that, for very good reasons, you contest. And one wonders why the British people didn't get it. Is it the fault of the party just didn't mobilize?
I think I don't want to repeat the same thing, but look. I think why did Clinton lose? Why did the Democrats lose after Clinton? And why has Obama's ratings gone down? Has Obama lived up to the promise of change? One word: change, change, change. That's what was said. And in the race between change and continuity, are we seeing more continuity and less change? Are we seeing more change and less continuity? Well, I'm not going to answer that, but I tell you what I said to Gordon Brown. And I was his political advisor, by the way. I worked in number 10 Downing Street. I was Gordon's political advisor. On the day he became Prime Minister, he stood in Downing Street. He used the word change 17 times in about 4 minutes. And then I think most people felt there was more continuity and less change. Well, we have to start delivering to our people as progressives. Otherwise, they aren't going to vote for us, and rightly so.
Mm-hmm. If I can give an American
Sure.
point of view, I happened to be in London last spring and saw one of the debates and sat around with a bunch of my friends from London there, and we watched the debate, and I thought it was clear that Gordon Brown had won the debate, and of course all the polls then suggested otherwise. And I said, what's going on? And they said, debates here are becoming more and more like political debates and campaigns in the United States. It had to do with whether Gordon Brown mentioned the questioner's name in responding to a question, or whether he just reeled off a bunch of data. And of course the data was right, but he didn't make the eye contact, and he didn't mention the name of the person and Cameron did a very good job at that. And so it was all this sort of glitter and shine, and a lot to do with the way the media was presenting the debates, and then the kind of follow-up to the debates. Said, it's just becoming more and more like campaigns in the United States. That's what the problem was.
Depressing.
Well, one last thing. I think the electoral problems of the left spread all throughout Europe, and much of it, some people argue, is attributed to too far of a shift to the right. Yeah. And it's not just not articulating the points. It's actually that the ideology of the parties have shifted, of the left-wing parties in Western Europe at least, have shifted to the right in a lot of countries. And so then the debate becomes between, like, John's side, which is re-articulate a left-wing position or triangulate more, I guess, would be the alternative. And I think that's the debate we'll see happen in many countries in the next 10 years.
There's a gentleman up there. Oh, sorry. Sorry, hi.
I have a related question about political culture, or I guess cultural politics as well. There has been, I think, a rightward shift in European politics as well as in American politics in the last 20 years or so, but I'm frequently made aware of the fact that I live in a country where the leading liberal candidates at the national level are probably articulating positions somewhere to the right of David Cameron. And I have to wonder, it's an old question, why is there no real socialist presence in American politics going back very far? But I'm wondering, could you talk about why, at least in my mind, there is a viable left-wing politics in Europe and not in the United States?
Okay, I'm not sure I can answer exactly that, but I was told not to use the word socialist, by the way.
Yes, word.
Somebody suggested, never mind calling left or don't use liberal nowadays, progressive. But let's be honest, I'm a socialist. I believe there's another way of running society and the economy too. But it has to be democratic, But as to why it is that a socialist party never took a proper route in the United States, look, there's a huge debate about that. I mean, there is a very, very interesting history of the labour movement in America, and somehow or another, all of that was lost, and it should be recovered because it's very inspiring to read about the struggles in the early part of the 20th century, and of course, there's a huge issue about race and slavery and your history, which I think makes it more complex culturally and in other ways too. But the truth is, in the end of the day, the power of money in American politics now is absolutely extraordinary. I described how I spent $12,000 in 5 years, and one guy here, losing candidate, spent $2.5 million. Look, somebody said to me earlier today, money talks. Well, money doesn't talk, it buys. Money buys. And people can be bought and sold. And probably parties can be bought and sold too, I imagine. I don't know. But if you allow your democracy to continue, look, Obama says he can raise $1 billion to run an election. $1 billion. Well, I don't know what implications that has. So I haven't come here to criticise Obama, but the truth of the matter is that you are in the hands. Your parties are in the hands of people who do not look like the rest of your society and don't behave in that way. So this is a very difficult. It seems to me it's a very difficult problem to resolve. So I'm sorry, I don't know what the answer is.
Yeah.
Sure.
Thank you very much. I wanted to get your clarity on what you mean by left. Because the categories that you used in your presentation, fairness, equality, and justice, did not sound very left to me. These were the qualities that were represented in the U.S. Constitution. And as you know, it left out a sizable section of the population. So it was not a left constitution. It was liberal. And so in the context of Thatcherism and the decline of social democracy in Europe, what do you mean by left? Because you talked about inequality, but I never heard you talk about exploitation and the consequences of that exploitation for social relations and politics. That's the first point. The second point is about Gordon Brown and the banks. Are we to understand that Gordon Brown supported nationalization? Or let's not deal with Gordon Brown. Let's deal with you, John. do you support nationalization? Because if we look at the experience of October, November, December 2008, what we saw was Gordon Brown actually stabilized the bank to make them stronger, to be more dominant in the British economy. So the measures that Gordon Brown took and that were taken in the United States in relationship to the banking system were actually to the detriment of the majority of the population. So I would like to know whether you favor popular control of the bank, as this last speaker quoted from Simon Johnson, and Simon Johnson calls for breaking up the banks. He was very clear. So I want to hear whether you are calling for the Simon Johnson alternative, which he says go back to regional and small banks, or for nationalization. And for you, sir, on the question of the strength of the banks and the financial system, I wondered if you could say something about the relationship to military and the role of the U.S. military and the financial system and the political system. Because what was not mentioned in this discussion about government is how the military is now acting on behalf of that financial sector, and the extent to which that military and what is driving the military is creating conditions for further militarization that we've seen. And we don't have to go to the quotation of Mr. FDR that was made by John.
Well, I seem to recognize that kind of discourse, and we often have those kind of debates on the left in Britain too. So I think I recognize where you're coming from. And let me say this: first of all, we did nationalise the banks. We didn't nationalise them all, but we did nationalise the banks. Over the first weekend, I was back in Downing Street, and Gordon Brown often said to me, well, you know, you've been in Downing Street 24 hours, 48 hours, and we took control. And I said it in my speech. We took public ownership of the banks to one degree or another. And had we not done so, it's true to say that the consequences would have been unthinkable, and they would have affected the United States too. As to what, and they are still nationalised. Not all of them, but the ones which were about to collapse. And it's true that they're still in public ownership now. But I also said in my speech that I thought we didn't take enough powers. And I think we should have done more, because we more or less left the structures in place. We just replaced private shareholders with the state. And that isn't exactly what I think should have happened. But my argument was about government, and I come to a country where there is a substantial body of opinion now arguing that the problem is government. And I wanted to show, actually, that even amongst the pioneers of founding fathers, the idea of government and equality and liberty were interconnected. And so I'm speaking in a particular context, in a particular moment in time. If you ask me what I think should be done with the banks, we're having a debate now inside the Labour Party. And one of the things which we had before the kind of financial, the globalization of the financial markets was, we used to have things called mutuals, and the banks were owned by the people who used the banks. They weren't owned by shareholders. There's a debate at the moment. One of the banks, called the Northern Rock, instead of it being a private bank, when the state lets go of it, it should be a mutual owned by the people. I think that's a very interesting debate. And the other thing is the debate which is taking place about the casino capitalism. The banks were playing casinos on the one hand, and the investment function on the other, whether we should separate the two and do structural reforms. So there is a debate going on inside the Labour Party, about exactly what form the financial services should take. But I said in my speech, the financial services should be there to support and serve the community, rather than the community being there to support the financial services and the banks, and we've got it wrong. And you made a second point. What was the second point? Oh, it was to somebody else.
About the military.
Yeah,
Eisenhower's great military complex, right? And I agree with you, of course, that when we talk about getting big government off our backs and talk about all of the sort of welfare payments that are being made, it's never considered the way in which the government, right, is financing a huge military-industrial complex, an American empire, right, that runs throughout the world, that helps to keep in place, I think, the kind of financial maneuverings and activities that goes under the label of globalization. So American taxpayers, right, not only lose jobs through globalization, and government does nothing to keep jobs at home or to create tax policies to keep corporations focused on developing the economies in their host countries. We're also paying a global police force to keep globalization safe. And I think Obama, despite campaign candidate Obama, made an awful lot of rhetoric about changing the policies, closing Guantanamo, closing down the secret prisons, reining in some of the military complex that the United States has globally. He has done nothing. In fact, he has increased expenditures and aid to this kind of military empire that the United States is involved with. So then you do have to ask the question. I don't think you can even call it liberal anymore, what exists in the United States. And this goes back to the quote from Simon Johnson about a new American oligarchy that, of all people, actually Teddy Roosevelt began to break up a little bit. And it was at that time that the top 1% had something like 25% of the income. It declined a bit, as I mentioned, in the 70s, around 10%, but it's back up to what it was prior to the Great Depression now. And I think it is because of a complex relationship between political power, wealth, and, yes, the Halliburtons and all of that are involved in the military industry as well. And that, when you look at big government paying for things, you need to be looking at that as well. So I'm not sure we're in disagreement.
We want to get one more question in before our reception. So who's next?
Take them all together.
Grant, do you just want to take them
Thank
all?
you for a very, very invigorating.
That's a thought. All three questions and then a quick final.
Yeah.
Go ahead, man.
Thank you for a very, very illuminating talk today. You began your discussion with your disagreement with the Iraq War, and then moved on to internal financial debates within Britain. And I'd like to go back to the international scene and ask you about the future of British and American policies regarding these uprisings in the southern Mediterranean rim.
Sure.
We have now seen American military intervention, and British intervention, which is going on right now, today, in Libya. I wonder what kind of role you see in the future for the West in supporting supporting progressive regimes in the countries with the emerging markets.
It's a big question, but I think let's take all three that were left and then quickly go.
I think there's actually one more.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go on, let's go for it.
This is more an observation, so if you want to respond to the question, I'll be very quick.
Go ahead,
Oh, well, so I am not a political philosopher, I'm not a political scientist, but I'm struck by a recurring theme through the last hour about the importance of words and meanings and words, some that we're not allowed to say and some that have mutated in various ways. And it seems to me that there's a danger that even progressives in their attempts to resuscitate the kind of government.
Oh.
We talk about.
Go on. We can hear you.
There's a tendency to draw a line between government and people government. You had a quote on the board about the consent of the government.
Come on, Tom.
The more we allow there to be a sense that government is something separate from the government, as opposed to the agents of government, like the other side, the easier it is for the right to succeed in life. Is the problem. Abstraction is how to make things bad, and that seems very undemocratic.
Yeah.
Seems like something that somehow could work, but I.
Okay.
Well, I think we should, but that's fine.
Was there somebody else?
All right.
Was there somebody else over there? Go on, go for it.
We'll ask it, and we'll get a very brief final thing. And then
Go
we'll
for
have
it.
a reception. And we'll continue the conversation over a glass of wine or soda.
My question is for specifically about Brexit.
Sure.
So you've been very critical of talking about the abolition of social programs under the Tory government. I was wondering where you think the money should be taken from. Do you think tapping into people London is a good idea, given that London is, the biggest global financial centre of the world, probably driving towards the UK economy, even if it's so critical to market capitalists? And also, my second question would be about education. And you talked about the Tories attacking that as well. And I got my education in undergraduate maybe for, I got paid for by the government. And I was thinking that nowadays it's the case that it's cost £9,000 a year, but you still get a blanket loan from the government. But which you only have to pay back once you have a salary worthy of a graduate. You say people would say that it's just the graduates paying back the benefits of the education that the government is giving them.
There's a lot there. Maybe a quick response, and then I think we're mindful of time here. So, John, you want to try to respond to a couple of those things you heard?
Well, I told you I was very much against the war in Iraq. It's a difficult time. In the end, it wasn't too difficult. I voted against my government, and I was right to do so in my own mind. Too many times, military actions by the West have been used for other reasons than liberation, quite frankly. And it's interesting, military actions tend to take place where petrochemical industries are to be found. And I noticed that there are petrochemical industries in Libya, by the way. Probably you did too. There are other humanitarian disasters in Africa, which I know you know well. And we haven't seemed to get the United Nations to do anything about it, but perhaps there's no petrochemicals yet being discovered there. Look, I think if the Arab Spring, as it's called, turns out to be a fresh wave of democratic uprisings, and the removal of tyrants, that's a good thing, but it's too soon to say that is the case. It looks good, but I think, I watch Al Jazeera and other TV channels as well as like Fox News. And it seems to me the situation is slightly more complex, certainly than Fox News would say. And so I think we need to watch it carefully. I think it's very interesting. I'm interested as well. Nobody's raised the question of Palestine and Israel, which I think is one of the cornerstones of the problems which are destabilising much of the Middle East and beyond too. And so I think we might have a chance to discuss that if people are interested afterwards. As far as words are concerned, there are always a battle over words. And usually words which are our words of progressives, and they tend to be either stolen from us or else nullified because so much effort is put into demonising progressives, socialists, people on the left, or however you want to describe us. I don't think, though, that it's right to say that we the people, that government is we the people entirely. Government has become an instrument, arguably, maybe it always was, an instrument of particularly deeply entrenched financial and other interests. I know that, I think it was Eisenhower, wasn't it, who talked about the military-industrial complex. You now need to speak about the military-financial-industrial complex. But the only problem is, I think most of the industry is gone from the United States, as it has done from Britain too. But it's right to note the battle over words. But I am not convinced that government is purely the instrument of the people anymore. My speech was really trying to say we need to seize control, take it back. As far as the UK is concerned, look, the whole of my speech was really saying that, there are deeply divided economic and social interests in all our societies, and in Britain too. And quite frankly, I think it's shocking to see that a crisis brought on us by irresponsible behaviour, immoral behaviour in the banks should then be paid for by the rest of us. Now, I've heard your arguments before from similar people as yourself, making the argument, we can't do anything about it because the country depends on the financial services. And it's true, of course, tens of thousands of people work in London on the financial services. But frankly, if we're going to be blackmailed as a country by sort of the financial services industry, then we will be always on the edge of another bubble. And bubbles burst. You may have noticed, when bubbles burst, people get sprayed. And that's what's happened. Now, it's true to say that, look, I mean, the cuts are deep. But what this government in the United Kingdom is doing is using the crisis as an excuse to roll back the state. And that's what the governor's doing in Wisconsin, it seems to me. What's he doing? It's not the fault of the labour unions or the teachers or the people who clean toilets that this country's in the disastrous situation it is. We were in New York yesterday. There are people living in tents in New York City. In tents. And working people too. Because they can't sustain the mortgages. We saw people yesterday in New York queuing up for food vouchers. The richest country on the earth. Some of them are working in the public services. The governor of Wisconsin seems to think they are the ones who are responsible, they're the ones who should pay. And quite frankly, my friend, your argument that we can't afford to take on financial interest because what's going to happen to the country is just wrong. It is simply wrong. We have to be able to do that. Otherwise, we will be forever in the thrall of these forces. We somehow have to find a way through this. And it does mean changing the economy. It does mean changing the class structures, too.
A lot to think about, and we'll continue the conversation outside. So thanks for